Hola, clase. Today we will be reading over this Dialogo aquí. This dialogue contains Ignacio, Roberto, Claudio, and Senor Castillo. Now, we know Ignacio and Roberto. We were introduced to them in the last Dialogo. And Ignacio lives in Puerto Rico, and he's friends with Roberto. Roberto used to live in Puerto Rico, but then he moved to the United States and he was living in Minneapolis, Minnesota for 2 years. All right? So Roberto has come back to Puerto Rico, and they're going to be hanging out in this dialogue. Remember that Ignacio was a little bit nervous. He told his sister Diana that he was a little bit nervous about Roberto coming back to Puerto Rico. And I assume it's because maybe he doesn't feel like they'd have very much in common after 2 years. All right, so let's take a look at this. So this dialogue occurs in El Campo de Baseball, the field of baseball, or in English, the baseball field. So we start out with these two characters here. This person is Claudio, and this is Ignacio. All right? And Claudio says, Oye, ¿qué haces? So oye means listen. It can mean hey. And ¿qué haces means what are you doing? So this is like saying, hey, what are you doing? To that, Ignacio says, espero a mi amigo. I wait for my friend. I'm waiting for my friend. Claudio says, ¿sabe él a qué hora empieza la práctica? Claudio says, does he know what time the practice begins? Ignacio says, yes. And then we have Claudio pointing to the field, and Ignacio is listening to what he's about to say. Claudio says, ¿Quieres practicar un poco conmigo? Do you want to practice a little with me? And Ignacio says, no gracias, prefiero esperar a Roberto aquí. No, thank you. I prefer to wait for Roberto here. All right, and in comes Roberto. So Roberto's here in the striped shirt. He's hugging Ignacio. And Roberto says, Ignacio, que gusto. Which means, Ignacio, what a pleasure. And Ignacio says, Roberto, cuánto tiempo? Roberto, how much time? Or so much time. In other words, Roberto, it's been a long time. And Roberto says, ahora tengo un amigo para hablar de deportes. All right? So Roberto is excited that he actually has a friend to talk sports with. Okay? And now it looks like there's a bat exchange going on here. It looks like Roberto is offering Ignacio his choice in a baseball bat. And Roberto says, ¿Prefieres este bate or este? O este. So he's saying, do you prefer this bat or this? Ignacio says, Yo prefiero este bate. ¿Juegas al béisbol en Minneapolis? He says, I prefer this bat. Do you play baseball in Minneapolis? And Roberto says, sí. I do. Yes, I do. All right. And now we have Roberto meeting with Senor Castillo. I assume he's the coach of the team. He's Mr. Castillo, and Roberto is meeting him. And at this time, Ignacio is sort of introducing Roberto. And Ignacio says, Senor Castillo, le presento a Roberto, viene de Minneapolis. Mr. Castillo, I present to you Roberto. He's from Minneapolis. And Mr. Castillo says, mucho gusto, nice to meet you. ¿Qué deportes juegan en Minneapolis? What sports do they play in Minneapolis? Roberto says, son locos con el fútbol americano. They are just crazy for football. They love to play football in the United States, and specifically in talking about Minneapolis. All right? And then the conversation continues, and Ignacio says, les gusta jugar al fútbol? So he's asking Robert this question. He's saying, do they like to play soccer? He's asking Robert if the people from Minneapolis like to play soccer. Remember, the word for soccer is football. Football. But the word for football is football americano. All right? So it's a little confusing, but pretty much in every country of the world except for the United States, they call soccer football. Okay? And in Spanish, it's football. All right? The football that we play here, like in the NFL, with like the 49ers and the Chargers and teams like that, well, that's football americano. Okay? So, if it's just the word football, we're talking about soccer. If it's football americano, we're talking about football. Okay? So again, Ignacio is asking, do they like to play football? And Roberto says, sí, pero no es tan popular como el fútbol americano. Mucha gente en los Estados Unidos piensa que el fútbol americano es más interesante que el fútbol. And he says, yes, but it's not as popular as football. A lot of people in the United States think that football is more interesting than soccer. All right. And now Mr. Castillo has left the scene, and it's just Roberto and Ignacio talking. And Roberto says, me gusta jugar al baloncesto y al tenis. Pienso que el tenis es menos divertido que el baloncesto. También me gusta nadar. So Roberto says, I like to play basketball and tennis. I think that tennis is less fun than basketball. Also, I like to swim. Ignacio says, me gusta correr más que nadar. Ignacio says, I like to run more than to swim. All right, now in comes Mr. Castillo. He's talking to Roberto. And Mr. Castillo says, ¿Piensas jugar en el equipo de baloncesto? This means, do you plan to play on a basketball team, or are you thinking about playing on a basketball team? And Roberto says, sí, también quiero jugar en el equipo de béisbol. ¿Puedo practicar con ustedes? Roberto says, yeah. Also, I want to play on a baseball team. Can I practice with you guys? And Mr. Castillo says, of course, let's go. Claro, vámonos, or vamos. All right, now Ignacio and Roberto are talking again, and Ignacio says, necesito tu ayuda. Quiero participar en un concurso. Ignacio is saying, I need your help. I want to participate in a contest. Now remember, this is that contest where it's a magazine contest where the person is supposed to describe a certain aspect of Latin American culture or Hispanic culture. And so that's the contest he's talking about. Roberto says, ¿Y qué piensas hacer? And what are you thinking of doing? Ignacio says, tengo una idea. Me gustaría hablar contigo sobre el proyecto. I have an idea. I would like to talk with you about the project. And finally, this is the very last, this is the very end of their conversation. So they're talking here. And Roberto says, claro, está bien. ¿Por qué no vienes a casa mañana por la mañana? So, of course, that's good. Why don't you come to my house tomorrow in the morning? So this is a little weird. Mañana means tomorrow, and it also means the morning. But that's what Roberto is saying to Ignacio. Why don't you come to my house tomorrow in the morning? And then Ignacio says, así también saludo a tu familia. Also, I can greet your family. Roberto says, ¿Por qué no invitas a Diana? Why don't you invite Diana? Remember, Diana is Ignacio's sister. And Ignacio says, Está bien, nos vemos como a las 10. He says, that's good. Nos vemos means see you. So, nos vemos como a las 10. See you at 10. All right, so there will be some questions associated with this reading today. What I'll do to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you guys is I will make a copy of these pages and I will include it. I will post it to our classroom page. Okay? So after you're done with this video, you can take a look at my posting here. I'll post a copy of this, and then there will be an assignment where you where you answer some questions based on this reading. All right? Go ahead and move on to that now.